Hey, this is Harrison here from Cross Creek Youth, and today I'll be covering 1 Samuel 13 through 15. And first things first, we have some announcements and stuff to take care of. So we have an Instagram page at Cross Creek Youth, and also we're having Wednesday Zoom hangouts for guys and girls later today. So if you want to join for a hangout session, feel free to. There's no pressure to join us on Zoom. So, back to 1 Samuel 13 through 17. Before I start, there are some common questions that pretty much everyone that I've talked to has been asking. These common questions are things like, when will this end? When will we be able to return to something like a normal? When will a vaccine come out? When will we feel safe to interact normally again? When can I hang out with my friends? When can I play sports or go to the gym? When can I get out of my house? And all of these questions at their root have to do with being saved from COVID-19. They're all questions of salvation, specifically when COVID-19 will end and when can we put this behind us. And I say this because there's a lot of similarity between the questions that we're asking concerning salvation from this specific circumstance, that is COVID-19, and the questions that the Israelites were asking back during around 1000 BC. And I'll pick this back up at the end. But Israel was asking similar questions of salvation, but their questions were things like, what if my farm will get burned today? Or what if my food gets stolen? Or what if it doesn't rain enough this year? Or things like, why can't we defend ourselves against people who keep raiding our land? And to the Israelites, what salvation looked like was having a strong military and big walls that could protect them against people who are raiding, or enough food stored up to last them during famines. And ultimately, what they're looking for is a place to relax and rest. And what that means is to rest from fighting, rest from worry and anxiety. And in their mind, that would come from having a strong military. And a strong military also in their mind required a strong king. So that's the broad setting. The more specific setting for 1 Samuel is that for 200 years, the Israelites have been asking for a king. And Moses called it out 200 years before this story. It says, at some point you'll ask for a king, and you can have a king, but that king won't be all that it's cracked up to be, and you'll end up basically not in a good circumstance due to the kings. And then to this story specifically, Saul's the first king for Israel. And as Garrett said last week, Saul's kind of like the Lance Armstrong in this case of kings. Another way of looking at it in this specific story is that Saul is like a reverse Sour Patch Kid or Warhead. And by that I mean, instead of starting out sour and getting sweeter over time as better, Saul starts out sweet and just gets progressively more sour over time, which means that he gets worse and does consistently worse things. So we'll look at it, and right now, if you want to, I would suggest reading chapters 13, 14, and 15 of 1 Samuel. Or I'll do a brief summary, and you can read each chapter before I do the summary so that it's fresh in your mind. So if you want to, take a second to pause the video, do some reading, and we'll start back up. So before we start, I'll pray us in briefly, and then we can start with the summary. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for giving us some time to think about and meditate in your word. And I pray that as we go over 1 Samuel, that this story and characters will become alive to people listening to this video, and I pray that they may become closer to you through reading this and through your word. I pray this in your name. Amen. So, we're going to start off in chapter 13. What's happening is Saul is getting ready for battle against the Philistines. And Samuel tells Saul to wait for 7 days so that Samuel can make preparations to make a sacrifice. The idea being that the entire Israelite army needs to be in God's good graces in order for them to become victorious in this battle. Saul waits 7 days, but doesn't wait until the end of the 7th day, which means that Saul gets impatient and Saul makes the sacrifice before Samuel gets there. That's a bad decision on Saul's part because Saul is not a priest. Samuel is a priest. It is not Saul's position to make sacrifices. It's Samuel's position to make sacrifices. And Saul made the sacrifice because he was afraid that people would leave and he wouldn't have enough soldiers to win the battle. So Saul's concern is valid in that if he loses the battle, then Israel won't have safety. And Saul is there, basically, he sees to guarantee the Israelites' safety. So, when Samuel comes up at literally the end of the sacrificial party gathering, because basically this is a gigantic barbecue at the end, Samuel basically tells Saul that because you made this choice, your lineage, instead of lasting forever, will come to an end. And Saul doesn't really take that very kindly, basically because the way that Samuel puts it is implicitly like Saul's going to be the king and none of his kids will be king after him. So, after this and after the poor sacrifice, Saul goes into battle and wins. And based on the description of how they won, that is, basically the Israelites went in to battle with farming implements because there were no blacksmiths to fashion their weapons. And they were going against people who were properly armed. So the Israelites won in spite of the fact that they weren't properly armed, which means that God intervened on the behalf of the Israelites and gave them a miraculous victory, even in spite of Saul's poor decisions and bad sacrifice. That's pretty much the summary of chapter 13. And we're going to move on to chapter 14. So if you want to take a second to read chapter 14, now would be a good time to read it. So in chapter 14, they're still fighting the Philistines. And Jonathan, Saul's son, sees an odd opportunity to turn the tide of the upcoming battle. What Jonathan does is he and his armor bearer go up to the camp of Philistines, and because there are only 2 of them, the Philistine guards don't take them as a threat. And so they let them into the camp with the implicit understanding that the Philistines are probably going to kill Jonathan and his armor bearer based on the dialogue. So when basically Jonathan and the armor bearer are able to sneak into the camp, they start fighting the Philistines, and this catches the Philistines off guard. Immediately after Jonathan and the armor bearer start fighting, God makes an earthquake happen and sets confusion upon the Philistines in their encampment so that the Philistines start all fighting each other, which in turn causes a huge ruckus, and the guards at the main camp where Saul is see this ruckus, inform Saul, and Saul gets really puzzled because why would the Philistines start fighting with themselves? In response to this question, he takes account. He sees that Jonathan and his armor bearer are missing from the camp. So he assumes that they are causing this ruckus in the encampment of the Philistines. Saul seizes upon this military opportunity and gives his second rash order, second mistake, in the form of an oath that says that anyone who eats before this battle is done will be cursed, which is kind of dumb because his soldiers will need food in order to be replenished in terms of energy and vitality. And he gives this oath knowing that Jonathan, his son, and the armor bearer are not present to hear this oath. What ends up happening at the end of the day is that Saul and his army end up beating the Philistines, in large part due to God's miraculous intervention and Jonathan's faith that set up the situation for Saul's victory. But while the army was pursuing the Philistines, Jonathan unknowingly broke the order of not eating by eating some honey in a forest that they were going through. And because the soldiers had not eaten all day, Saul basically gave that order, prevented the soldiers from eating, and the soldiers were very hungry after fighting, which is kind of expected and obvious. What ends up happening is that the soldiers start eating the livestock that they capture without properly preparing the livestock for cooking and eating. What that means specifically in this passage is that they ate the animals with blood. So they didn't take the time to drain it because they were so hungry, they just started eating. This is completely against the ceremonial laws and food laws of the Israelites, and everyone would have obviously known that this was a bad idea. And what ultimately this results in is that Saul's army has become unclean because they've touched blood outside of a ceremonial context. And Jonathan also has become in this cursed state, as in he's going to be cut off from God because Saul has basically said that for anyone who eats before the fighting is done, and Jonathan ate before the fighting was done. This all comes to head when Saul asked God a question, basically, should I go and fight more Philistines tomorrow? And God doesn't answer. And Saul incorrectly assumes that God does not answer because someone ate food. God really doesn't answer because Saul keeps making these poor decisions and doesn't take God seriously, or doesn't take God's word seriously, more accurately. In the story, they cast lots, and they come to find out that Saul comes to find out that Jonathan ate food, specifically honey, in the forest while pursuing the Philistines. And the people twice now save Saul from his poor decisions and save Jonathan. Because the people first complain to Saul that they are eating ceremonially unclean food, which means that the people recognize that something's up and something's wrong with their situation from eating that food with blood before Saul does, which is not a mark of a good leader. And the people also recognize that it was Jonathan who snuck into the camp, who caused all the ruckus in the first place. And they credit the victory to Jonathan that day for trusting in God to basically fulfill God's promises. So the people, in the story it says they ransom Jonathan, which means that they give a substitute sacrifice in Jonathan's stead because Saul made a stupid order. The probably one of the most important lines, though, is in verse 52 of chapter 15, which is at the very end. And it summarizes who Saul is as a person and as he is as a king, filling this role for Israel. And that verse it reads, and when Saul saw any strong man or any valiant man, he attached him to himself. So basically, Saul is going around picking up everyone who would form a good army and bringing them on board. And that tells us that Saul is concerned about his military strength and about his safety and wants to win basically every battle he goes into. He hedges his bets. If we take a second and go back and look at Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 16 and 17, there's a prohibition from Moses about what kings are and are not allowed to do. And when you read that, it's going to talk about having many horses and many wives. And that's not really relevant in this case. And until you realize that if a king has many horses, that means he has a large army and a large military force. And if a king has many wives, that means he has a lot of political connections, which also means he has a large number of armies at his disposal through allies. So what Moses is saying from God is that Israel is not supposed to have a huge military strength or huge military power. They're just supposed to have basically a defense force. Saul doesn't really see his army that way. So what Saul is doing is against the original purpose of Israel in this case. And that pretty much closes up chapter 15. So we're going to move on to chapter 16. In chapter 16, God, through Samuel, tells Saul to wipe the Amalekites off the map completely by destroying everything. It's a very clear order. God gives this order multiple times in the Old Testament, and a lot of times the Israelites fail to follow the order. And every time that God gives the order and the Israelites don't follow it, it comes back to bite Israel later on down the road. So it sets Israel up for failure however many years later. Sometimes that's the next day. Sometimes that's 200 years later. But it doesn't turn out well for Israel. The reason it comes back to bite Israel is because God promised the promised land to Israel. And part of the promises of that land is the ability to rest and the ability to prosper as a nation. What this is the equivalent to is God has given the Israelites a home so that they can sleep in. And if you're going to sleep at night, you don't want a robber or a murderer sleeping in the bedroom down the hall from you. You kind of want to kick that murderer or robber out of your house before you go to sleep, because that would be a dangerous situation. What if the murderer kills me in the night? It's basically what the Israelites have been asking for the past 200 years. So when God tells them to kick the murderer out of the house or the robber out of the house, they sometimes do it and sometimes don't. And in this case, they didn't. So, in the specifics for chapter 16, Saul gets the order to wipe the Amalekites off the map. And Saul does a good thing by telling some of his allies who are living in the same area that they need to leave so they don't get killed, and those allies leave. But Saul does a bad thing in that he returns from the battle with Agag, who's the king of the Amalekites, which automatically means that Saul didn't actually listen to God's order. And he returns with the best livestock, so basically the juiciest pieces of meat that they could find. And when Saul comes back, Samuel is pretty much at his wit's end with Saul at this point. And Samuel gives a very, very sarcastic answer, or a question of, why do I hear livestock and the noises of livestock when there should be absolute silence except for your men returning? And Saul gives the answer that, the people wanted to keep the best livestock to sacrifice to God, which sacrifices to God are a good thing in this context when God had said that everything was supposed to be devoted to destruction. Keeping what is supposed to be devoted towards destruction alive is not a good thing to use as a sacrifice, because it's already been purposed out for one end. The other thing to remember here is this type of sacrifice with like a cow or a sheep typically ends up in about half of that animal being burnt for God and the other half of the animal being eaten by everyone, which turns into a gigantic barbecue. Think of something like the 4th of July or Memorial Day or something like that. Which meant that the people had their motives to eat really good food by saving this really good livestock. And Samuel basically calls out Saul saying, well, you're blaming this on the people, but really you're their king and you should have better control over your people because you just had a victory, so you're pretty popular in their eyes. And Saul comes back and doesn't really have a good answer. And Samuel, at this point, tells Saul that he's no longer good in God's eyes. And we come across this word in verse 11 and 34. That's regret, and it's God's regret. And because Saul hasn't taken God's word seriously, God regrets making Saul king over Israel. And at the end of the chapter, we see that Samuel ends up having to do the job of Saul by killing Agag. And that's not really Samuel's job in this case, because Saul received the order, and Saul is the head of the military. So that original order at the beginning of the chapter was for Saul and not Samuel. The thing is, when we get to this word, regret, with God, that brings up some questions that can be kind of hard to parse and think through. So did God make a mistake with Saul? Should Saul have been king over Israel? Should it have been a different person at that point in time? Did Saul set a bad example or a good example about kings that Israel would have to deal with for the next couple hundred years? All of these questions, which takes us back to the Sour Patch Kid analogy, whereas normally with the Sour Patch Kid, it starts out from sour to sweet. And in this case, Saul started out sweet. The people were super happy to have him as king, and then he just gets progressively worse as sour over time until basically he got so sour that it was no longer a pleasant thing for God or for the Israelites. In order to fully understand this, we have to go into the idea of timing in the Bible. And timing is very important. We hear Jesus talk about timing in the New Testament a lot. And also from about Genesis 12 to Chronicles 30 or to 2 Chronicles 36, that time span is about 1600 years, give or take. Which is basically the first event in recent history to the last event in the Old Testament in recent history. And throughout this, God reveals himself at certain points in time. Saul is the first king, setting up David and Solomon, and then the next series of kings in the divided kingdoms. So Saul sets the stage for David to be king and then David's lineage. So basically, why does this story matter to us? And you can ask that in some form of questions like, why does why 3,000 years ago does a person matter? Was Israel initially happy to have a king? And that's yes. Did the Israelites think that Saul was going to be their salvation against everything that had been happening to them for the past 200 years? The answer is yes. Did he save them? Did Saul save them from all of their enemies? The answer is no. And then was Saul Israel's salvation like they had hoped from a king? The answer is no. But did Saul take Israel one step closer to Jesus? And the answer is yes, because he set Israel up for David to be king. And David is a man after God's own heart, and Jesus is David's lineage. So I've done a lot of ragging on Saul, but Saul's saving grace throughout all of this story is that he did not worship other gods. And throughout the next couple of books of the Bible, there are a bunch of kings, and they're judged on whether or not they're a good king based on whether or not they follow God's law. Saul's kind of in this gray area where he loves God, but doesn't really take God's word seriously. And that's a problem for the king of Israel. Saul knew ultimately that salvation came from God, but if you read the story, there's a bunch of things that he doesn't take seriously that come from God that he should take seriously. And the comparison between Saul and this story comes out from Jonathan and Samuel, who both have a lot of faith and a lot of trust in God. Jonathan takes one person to go up to fight the Philistines. That's a bad military strategy, but he still does it in full faith that God will see victory through for them. Samuel listens to God, and in multiple cases across the book of 1 Samuel, fights against overwhelming odds and comes out victorious because God has told him to do that. And they take God's word seriously because they have faith in God more so than themselves, which Saul kind of wavers back and forth on. So some parallels, picking back up from the beginning, some parallels that this story has today are things that we should and should not do now as Christians. You can see that Saul got impatient, and his impatience comes and is ultimately a very large mistake. We should be patient as we wait for whatever form of salvation comes from this virus. And I don't see things as mutually exclusive. If a scientist develops a vaccine, that vaccine can also come from God, working through the scientist. That's not a mutually exclusive form of salvation. He may provide a vaccine, he may not. That's the future to tell. That's in God's plan that we don't know. We also can't know the timing, so ultimately we do have to be patient. We should also not act rashly like Saul, where Saul was actually explicitly told the timing back for 7 days for the sacrifice, and he got impatient and acted rashly. We should not be impatient, and we should not act rashly. We should take God seriously, listen to his word, and remember that ultimately salvation rests in God and not human effort, alone apart from God. And that anything that we do in terms of getting out of this comes from God and from his writing history. So, with that being said, I'd like to close this in prayer. So please bow your heads, and I will pray us out. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for giving us your word and your revelation. I pray that as we listen to and cover 1 Samuel 13 to 15, that Saul's story may talk to our hearts and our souls and our minds. And I pray that as we go about this next week, we may take your word seriously and find the time to be free from anxiety, to listen to your word and how you speak to us through various means. And I pray all this in your name. Amen.